Being 97 ayes and 44 nays, the motion to table prevails. Chair recognizes Representative Leach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, on page 79, my amendment will ensure that our efforts to continue fighting against efforts that, for abortion providers and or their affiliates to get access to taxpayer funds, that we continue to be vigilant in the fight to prevent that from happening. This amendment, which is found on page 79, prohibits abortion providers and their affiliates from teaching sex ed classes or providing the curriculum for human sexuality instruction in our schools. I believe that this is going to be left to the will of the House. I move passage.
Chair recognizes Representative Price.
Thank you, members, Mr. Speaker. Members, this is similar to HB 205. It's a restriction on who actually prepares the materials. I think it's a belts and suspenders amendment. I think it's good, but I want to leave it to the will of the House. I'll be voting yes.
Anyone wishing to speak on for or against the amendment? Chair recognizes Representative Leach to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I move passage.
Question occurs in the adoption of the amendment. It's a record vote. The clerk ring the bell. Vote aye. Vote nay. Show Mr. Price voting aye. Have all members voted? Have all voted? Being 96 ayes and 46 nays, the amendment is adopted. Chair recognizes Representative White.
Thank you. This is an amendment to my amendment, but it is a rider that will assure the Title V abstinence funds are spent in a manner that complies with each of the A through H components of federal law regarding the teaching of abstinence education. And I believe the chairman.
Mr. Speaker.
And is it acceptable? And it's acceptable by the chairman.
There's an amendment to the amendment. Would you like to lay out the amendment first?
Or do I read it?
Yes. The following amendment to the amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Okay.
I'll just ask.
Amendment by White of Bell.
Explain it. Explain the amendment. You have the amendment.
Chair recognizes Representative White.
The amendment of the rider will assure that the federal and state intent for the definition of abstinence is followed when the primary, middle school, and high school programs are administered by DSHS.
Move adoption.
And, Mr. Speaker, I move adoption.
We go into Article 11.
Mr. Speaker,
Turner, for what purpose?
are we on the amendment to the amendment or the?
We're on the amendment to the amendment.
Okay,
Yes.
I'll hold my question until the amendment to the amendment.
Ms. White sends up an amendment to the amendment. Acceptable to the author. Is there objection? Chair has none. The amendment to the amendment is adopted. We're on the White amendment as amended. Mr. Turner?
Would the gentlelady yield for a question?
White, do you yield for a question?
Gentlewoman, yes, I will yield.
Lady yields.
Thank you, Representative White. I've not seen your amendment to the amendment. Can you explain how it changed the original amendment?
Well, in the second paragraph, we just added that the funds appropriated in Strategy A33, abstinence education, must be used to implement sexual education programs that must comply with each of the A through H components of the abstinence education program under Section 510B2 of the Social Security Act 42 USC Section 710. And I believe it is acceptable by the author.
And that's is that the 8-point plan that's written into the Social Security Act?
Yes, the A through H. Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you're aware that's federally mandated?
Well, I am aware of that, but I can see that it is a very good mandate for abstinence education.
Okay. What would happen, though, if Congress or the administration were, or future Congress or administration were to change those guidelines? Based on your amendment, we would be locked into whatever the federal government decides at any given time. Is that right?
Not necessarily, because we would have it locked in under this guideline here.
Does it specify that if the law changed, then it would no longer be the case that we would be locked into that?
No, I
Okay.
do not believe so.
I just want to raise that because we're tying what we're doing to federal standards that could change based on what Congress or Congress and future administrations decide to do. And I have an amendment to your amendment that I'd like to bring down and see if you'd consider.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
She's bringing an amendment. He's bringing an amendment.
Amendment by Turner of Tarrant.
Chair recognizes Representative Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this amendment to Representative White's amendment will ensure that students receive medically accurate, evidence-based health education in addition to abstinence education. And the federal guidelines that Representative White refers to in her amendment do not include the requirement that evidence-based, medically accurate, and age-appropriate information on pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, and HIV prevention methods be taught. And polling shows that an overwhelming majority of Texans agree on a bipartisan basis that it's important for students to get comprehensive, age-appropriate, and medically accurate sex education that includes information on birth control as well as abstinence. And studies indicate that young people who receive comprehensive education are 50% less likely to have an unintended pregnancy than those who receive abstinence-only education. And I would just add that I think that all of us agree we never allow the federal government to control what we do if we can make our own decisions here in Texas. And I don't think we should start with this amendment. And two, when we talk about unintended pregnancies, let's remember that a lot of those are Medicaid births. And we're going to talk a lot about the Medicaid budget. These are Medicaid births that can be prevented through better education. And so I would move adoption.
Mr. Dale, for what purpose?
Will the speaker yield for a question?
Will the gentleman yield?
Gentleman yield, not you.
I will yield for questions.
So, did you say you want evidence-based education? Is that what you said?
That's what the amendment calls for. To quote, it says medically accurate, objective, and complete by mainstream professional organizations and agencies with expertise in the relevant field, including the Federal Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
So is it medically accurate to say that abstinence prevents pregnancy?
Absolutely.
Okay. Is it medically accurate to say abstinence can help prevent STDs as well?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And I would just add, Representative Dale, because you're absolutely right, that nothing in this would supplant what's required with respect to abstinence only, simply add to it.
Mr. Speaker, will the gentleman yield?
Does the gentleman
yes.
yield?
Thank
Yes,
you.
I'd be happy to.
And you may have said this before, Representative Turner. Where does this information come from? Medically accurate information. Who is it coming from?
In my amendment, Representative Turner, it calls for mainstream professional organizations, so that can include the American Medical Association, other similar groups, and specifically the Centers for Disease Control and U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
Does it state those groups specifically?
CDC and USDHHS, it does, yes.
Sorry, so what you say? I'm sorry.
The amendment specifically cites the Centers for Disease Control and the United States Department of Health and Human Services.
And is it limited to them only?
It is not limited to them. The amendment reads including. So it names them, but it does not limit to just those two agencies, no.
Would you consider limited to those agencies alone, or do you want to leave it open to other agencies?
I would consider that. I don't know if it's possible to amend an amendment to an amendment. We'd have to ask that of the speaker, but I would certainly be open to discussing that with you and others, certainly Representative.
We're going to cut it down.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Mr. Speaker,
Ms. Gonzalez, for what purpose?
does the gentleman yield?
Gentleman yield?
I do.
Gentleman yields.
Representative Turner, did you know that Texas has the highest rate of teen pregnancy?
It's one of the highest, yes.
One of the highest. And it's the third highest in repeat teen pregnancies, correct?
I believe that's right.
And didn't the Texas demographer say during the County Affairs Committee hearing during the interim that the biggest thing that state legislators should consider in regarding the demographics is teen pregnancies?
I believe that's right, yes.
Yes, sir, he did. I was sitting in that committee during the interim, and he was making a point that we need to pay attention to repeat teen pregnancies. So do you believe that your amendment providing medically accurate sex education could decrease the number of teen pregnancies?
Absolutely, and we've seen studies that indicate that young folks who have comprehensive education are 50% less likely to have an unintended pregnancy, so that would certainly encompass the vast majority of our teen pregnancies, yes.
Thank you.
Would gentleman yield questions?
Mr. Phillips, for what purpose?
Would gentleman yield for questions?
Gentleman yield?
Yes.
I just want to make sure, you were talking about different organizations. Do you believe Planned Parenthood would qualify as one of those organizations?
Representative Phillips, Chairman Phillips, Planned Parenthood is not mentioned in this amendment. Again, the only two agencies that are mentioned are the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
I know that wasn't the question, though. Would they qualify? Do you think they fit the definitions that you set out for the organizations that could provide this information?
Tell you the truth, I haven't really thought about it. If you think that's something that we need to look at, I'm happy to consider that. I think
you'd agree with me.
If I could answer your question, my goal with this amendment is to simply provide that we're providing some evidence-based, medically accurate education to young people in addition to, not in place of, but in addition to the existing abstinence-only curriculum. If there are concerns about the different organizations that might be involved, we could certainly address that.
You'd be agree. Anyway, I just want to make the point. If you don't know that they wouldn't fit this definition, then I think that answers the question for a lot of us about this amendment. So thank you.
Sure. I move adoption of the amendment.
Chair recognizes Representative White in opposition.
Members, I move to table the the amendment.
Chair recognizes Representative Turner to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I think everyone knows what this is about. This is simply about making sure that we provide some medically accurate, evidence-based education for young people in addition to the existing abstinence-only curriculum. And this is something that polls have consistently shown has broad bipartisan support across the state of Texas. So I would ask that you vote no on the motion to table.
Representative White moves to table. The question is on the motion to table. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Representative Turner voting no. Representative White voting aye. Davis of Harris, no. Morgan Meyer voting aye. Have all voted. Have all voted. There were 94 ayes and 49 nays. The motion to table prevails.
I recognize Representative Spitzer.
His amendment to amendment, make sure
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
the federal money.
Can I move passage?
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Turner, for what purpose?
will the gentleman yield?
Spitzer,
Yes,
do you
I'll
yield?
yield for question.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Spitzer, Dr. Spitzer,
Yes, sir.
in your amendment, you're reducing monies for STD and HIV?
I'm moving the money from the STD HIV into abstinence education, yes. That's correct.
Okay. Now, you will agree with me that in terms of the need, there would be a need for monies for STD and HIV as well as for abstinence, right?
Absolutely, and I am, there was to be $191 million. I'm moving over a 2-year period over biennium. I would move $3 million of that, moving it to $188 million. The current ratio, if passed, would be $188 million to 8. So
Right,
we're
I understand
still
that.
very far favoring 25 times STD prevention, AIDS prevention over abstinence education.
But the reality is, in the state of Texas, Texas has the third highest number of HIV diagnoses in the country. Are you aware of that?
And we're funding it 25 times greater. Yes, sir, I am.
We're funding it at 25 times greater to abstinence.
To abstinence education. We're funding it at the full level the federal government wishes to. Like I said, if we went
I
lower.
understand.
Okay.
But in the base appropriations bill, are you aware that we doubled the amount of money on abstinence from where it was to the amount that we put into the bill?
I was not aware of that.
Right. Well, we substantially increased the amount of money going to abstinence programs. And are you aware that in respect to the abstinence programs, that those dollars are being given out to various, let's say, organizations? I mean, you're aware of that?
I am aware of that, yes. My wife actually works on the board of one of those various organizations.
Right.
She doesn't work on the board. It's an unpaid position. But
Right. And with respect to those organizations, and really, I wasn't going to stand up because I voted to provide the additional money for abstinence. But you're aware that those organizations self-report, which means we don't directly audit them. They provide us with a report of what they are doing. They're one of the few organizations where they provide their own reporting to the state. And the reason why I'm raising the issue is that when we are taking money from HIV, from individuals with HIV, I mean, do you not think that it is significant that Texas has the third highest number of people with HIV?
I think that's
Is that not significant?
I think it's significant, and I think we're still addressing that to the point of 25 times what we're doing for anything else. And again, up to the level that the federal government asked us to do it so that we continue to get the matching funds.
Right, but one of the reasons why we are addressing it at 25% higher, and you're comparing it to abstinence, but I'm talking about people who are walking around in the state of Texas, men and women, who are currently suffering from this particular ailment that need to be treated. We already know that they exist, and they need the care. They need the health care. I mean, do you not see the difference between someone who is already diagnosed and a program that's where we are providing millions of dollars just for abstinence programming? Is there not a significant difference here?
To read it directly out of this is HIV STD prevention. This is not about treatment of people who currently have the disease.
But the reality
yes, we
is,
need to continue to currently treat people that have the disease.
I understand that. But we do know in the state of Texas that 1 out of 6 people with HIV in the United States do not know that they are infected. Texas has the third highest number of HIV diagnoses in the country. And I think you will agree with me that instead of cutting from this particular strategy, quite frankly, we need to be doing more. Is it okay with you to have people walking around in the state of Texas that are undiagnosed, but they have HIV? Is that okay with you?
I would prefer that they're diagnosed.
And don't you think
and provide appropriate treatment?
And in order to get appropriate treatment, we need the resources, correct? The monetary resources.
There are several methods of preventing HIV, and we should be educated in all of those.
Right. And the point that I'm trying to make, is it not a good objective that for the state of Texas to be in the business of saving people's lives?
Absolutely, we should be. And abstinence will prevent many cases of HIV. Certainly not all, and it's certainly not foolproof, but it does prevent many cases of HIV. So we're treating the same thing. We're just going about it different ways. But I agree completely.
Then how much money?
Needs to be treated, needs to be prevented.
How much money would you want to place in the abstinence program? How much money would you want to put there?
Right now, we're putting $8 million.
How much money do you think is needed to be put there?
The amount of money that needs to be put there.
How much money do you think is needed to go into the abstinence program? If you had your brothers, how much money would you put there?
Originally, I was trying to put $10 million in there total, which would be $5 million plus another $5 million. And so as it is now, I'm doing $8 million. And frankly, some of the organizations that you mentioned don't take the funding. And so there's still a lot of AIDS education that goes on out there with non-governmental funding.
Well, I understand that.
But I do prefer that if we're going to fund it, that we should, as a rule, do what's valuable in our community. In my community, 25 to 1 would be considered a large amount of funding for STD AIDS prevention. In other communities, it may not be appropriate. Maybe they need 30 or 50 to 1.
How much money is in the base bill for abstinence? How much money is in the base appropriation bill for abstinence?
There's $5 million.
Started off with 5?
5.
Because I believe there's 10 in the base bill. How much is in, I'm talking about the base appropriation bill that's on the, and how much money is in the bill that's on the floor today? That's already for abstinence on the floor today.
In the number that I had seen, it was $5 million to $191 million. I'm not sure if that was per biennium. I was under the impression that was for the biennium and not for the per year.
No, and I stand to be corrected, but I do believe we doubled the amount of money that's in the abstinence program from what was in the base bill. By the time this bill went through the entire appropriations committee, I believe we doubled that amount. Now, I stand to be corrected. Let's assume that there's $10 million in the bill that's before the House floor today. How much are you saying to us that should be put in the abstinence program? How much money do you want to put in the abstinence program?
$13 million. It depends on what it is exactly. But when I look at that, I look at priorities. And our priorities need to be that we're going to talk to people about abstinence education at least 1 hour out of every 25 times.
I understand that you want it to be a priority, but I'm trying to figure out what is the monetary need. How much money need to be placed in the abstinence program before you believe we have met that objective? What is your goal?
My goal is for everybody to be abstinent until they're married.
Well, and my goal is for everybody to be walking around AIDS-free, HIV-free, and to me, that's a goal. But the question that I'm trying to ask from you today, how much money would you put in the abstinence program that you would be satisfied with? How much money do you want? Just how much money do you want?
I want enough money to accomplish the goal, and right now, not everybody is there for either your goal or my goal.
Well, what goal are we seeking? I mean, is it based on some study? Is it based on some report? When do we know we have met that amount? If you're saying to me you need $50 million in abstinence, tell me where you're getting that number, and then we can appropriate $50 million. I'm just trying to figure out how much do you need in order to satisfy your objective?
My objective, again, is so everybody knows that abstinence is the best way to prevent HIV. Abstinence is the best way to prevent sexually transmitted diseases. We're clearly not at that stage yet.
Okay, but how much money will be needed to achieve your objective?
I would like to have as much so we could.
You want as much as we're willing to give you. So there's really no end. Basically, you will take as much money as people are willing to give you. If we gave you $1 billion on abstinence, would that be enough? Or will you want 2? Or would you want 3? The point that I'm trying to make, what is the fiscal connection between what you are asking for and the return for the people in the state of Texas? How do I budget for your request?
It's very well laid out here, and I think that would be adequate for this.
But as a budget writer, what measuring rod do I use to determine when I have met your objective?
I think this is a great start right here, and I would turn to you being the expert budget writer and let me know.
Mr. Schaefer raises a point of order. Gentleman's time's expired. Point of order is well taken and sustained. Mr. Turner, for what purpose?
For an extension of time, please, sir.
Members, Representative Turner has moved to extend the member's time. Is there an objection?
Oh.
Members' first extension of time is usually granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
There is none. Gentleman's time is extended.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the gentleman yield for a quick question?
Gentleman will yield for a question.
Gentleman yields.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Spitzer. Do you think that there is an amount that's too much for abstinence training?
Personally, I do not.
So abstinence training and abstinence education is very important, correct?
It's very important.
And so there's no amount that you can put on abstinence training, because when you have abstinence training, that prevents a lot of other things that we're dealing with, correct?
It does extend well beyond the realm of STDs, yes, sir.
Right, and so to fund, I mean, we all make decisions and we all make bad decisions, but to continue to fund decision-making by people, I think is a dangerous precedent to set, don't you?
Yes, sir, I would agree with that.
Okay, so thank you for this amendment. I don't think we can have enough money for abstinence training, because the matriculation of that affects a lot of things in our society. So thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker. Valid for what purpose?
Gentleman yield?
Spitzer, do you yield?
I'll yield for a question.
Yes.
Did you know, I just wanted to make it a point, Chairman Sylvester Turner is an excellent debater and has very good points, as he always does. But one thing I did want to point out was he mentioned that HIV, Texas is number 3 in HIV infections in the country. It's probably because we're the second largest state in population. California has roughly 38 million people. We have 27 million, and we're 36% larger than the third state, New York and Florida, right at 19 million. So I just want to take that in context. I want to make that point. I don't know if you were aware of that.
I was not. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Mr. Speaker.
Been brought us for what purpose?
May I inquire of the representative? Will you yield for a question?
Yield for a question.
Yeah, yield for a question.
Gentleman yields.
You know, Representative Turner, Scott Turner, brought up a very good point that in front of your name there's a prefix, right? And that prefix is doctor?
Yes, sir.
And I'm not talking doctor like I'm a doctor of law. I'm talking medical doctor, correct?
That's correct.
And you feel as a medical doctor that the position you're taking on, not just from a fiscal standpoint, but the actual position that you're taking on this issue is prudent for somebody in the medical community, a scientist?
Yes, I do.
You really do?
Yes.
You're going to stand here in front of these men and women as Dr. Spitzer, not Representative Spitzer, and believe that this is a prudent amendment to take?
Yes, I do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Move passage. I move passage.
Recognize Mr. Turner of Harris to speak in opposition to the amendment.
Right. On the, Mr. Speaker, members, this is on the amendment to the amendment, and I believe under the amendment to the amendment, the money is being pulled from the STD HIV strategy and being given to the abstinence program. So I want to be very clear in my position. I'm not standing before you to say that the abstinence program is not valid, because for me on this floor, and including myself, I think abstinence is a valid program. But monies to STD and HIV are equally valid as well. The point that I would only make, and let me use the example so that hopefully everyone will understand where I'm coming from. If you have two children, does it make sense if you have two children to take food from one in order to feed the other? Because in my view, that's how I see this program. You're taking from one valid program in order to go to the other. And I think that is wrong. And that's why I believe it's ill-founded. We're not going to take it from DPS. We're not going to take it from all of these other strategies. But if I got two kids, I love them both. And I'm not going to pick and choose. Solomon didn't do it, and neither should the legislature.
Go ahead on. Amen. Anyone else wishing to speak on, for, or against the amendment to the amendment? Seeing none, Chair recognizes Representative Spitzer to close.
I move for adoption.
Question occurs on the adoption of the Spitzer amendment to the amendment. Is there any objection? Chair is none. The amendment is... There is objection, members. It's a record vote. Clerk will please ring the bell. Show Mr. Spitzer voting aye and Mr. Turner of Harris voting no. Show Mr. Coleman and Mr. Dutton and Mr. Miles all voting no. Have all members voted? Mr. Patty voting aye, Mr. Parker voting aye. Have all members voted? Mr. Keffer voting aye. Mrs. Burkett voting aye. Have all members voted? There being 93 ayes, 51 nays, the amendment is adopted. Following amendment to the amendment, the clerk will please read the amendment.
Amendment by Dutton.
Chair recognizes Mr. Dutton to explain his amendment.
Mr. Speaker and members, this is a silly amendment because this is a silly amendment it's amending.
Chair recognizes Mr. Spitzer in opposition to the amendment.
I move to table.
Chair recognizes Mr. Spitzer has moved to table. Chair recognizes Mr. Dutton to close.
Mr. Speaker and members, what this amendment does is it says that the money is going to follow the problem. And apparently Mr. Spitzer has a problem in his district.
Mr. Dutton offers up an amendment to the amendment. Mr. Spitzer has moved to table that amendment. Question is on the motion to table. There's a record vote. Clerk will please ring the bell. Show Mr. Spitzer voting aye, Mr. Dutton voting no. Show Mr. Leach voting aye, Mr. Patty voting aye, Mr. Price voting aye, Mr. Garnett Coleman voting no. Have all members voted? Have all members voted? There being 95 ayes and 47 nays, the motion to table prevails. Members, we have resolved all the amendments to the amendment. Is there anyone wishing to speak on, for, or against the Spitzer amendment as amended? Mr. Turner?
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the author of the amendment a couple of questions when he's back at the microphone.
Seeing no one to speak other than Mr. Spitzer, the chair recognizes Mr. Spitzer to close on his amendment as amended. Mr. Turner?
Would the gentleman yield for some questions?
Gentleman yield for questions?
I will yield for questions.
Gentleman yields.
Thank you, Representative. So as amended, your amendment is going to put an additional, how many $1 million into abstinence only?
$3 million over the biennium.
$3 million over the biennium, okay. Did you know that Texas has received more federal abstinence-only funding than any other state in the country?
I was unaware of that.
Okay. It's true. And did you know that we also have concurrently the nation's 5th highest teen birth rate?
I don't, as a physician, I see that a lot, and I don't doubt that for a second.
Okay. And did you also know that Texas has the single highest repeat teen birth rate?
I was unaware of that, but again, not surprised.
Okay. Did you know that the state of California, which did not participate in the federal abstinence-only funding program and actually bars abstinence-only education in its public schools, has a teen birth rate that's nearly half the rate of the state of Texas?
No.
Knowing those facts now, do you see why some of us, myself included, question the wisdom of putting more money into an abstinence-only program, which is concurrent with us having skyrocketing teen birth rates, repeat teen birth rates, and is proving by any objective measure to be ineffective?
I disagree. I think abstinence is the, as a physician, I can tell you that abstinence is the only 100% perfect method of birth control.
Oh, I agree with that.
It's also impossible to get a sexually transmitted disease without sex.
I completely agree with that, but in the light of the fact that we have one of the highest teen birth rates, highest repeat teen birth rate, objectively, can you say that abstinence only is working when we are getting more money for it than any state in the country?
It may not be working well, but to say it's not working, to say that continuing to move more money, I mean, abstinence education is HIV prevention. They're essentially the same thing. I'm moving money from one place to the other, but they're accomplishing the same goal, which is to keep people from getting HIV. Unwanted pregnancy is another one of those issues, then that's a good byproduct.
Well, I would agree with you that it's not working well. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Dutton, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield?
The gentleman will yield for a question.
Gentleman yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you. What do you know what the stats are in your district in regards to this measure?
We have too many STDs and we have too many unplanned pregnancies.
And do they teach abstinence now?
There is not much sexual education that goes on in the schools. There's some, but it's not enough. And to that effect, my wife and I both volunteer in the school to do education about sex, and some of that is abstinence education.
And you teach abstinence, I suppose?
We do teach abstinence education, yes.
Okay.
I mean, the school's perfectly open to teach whatever they want, but when we come in, that's what we teach.
I understand.
That's what we believe, and she's a physician also.
Well, what I'm trying to get at is, I wonder what we can expect, or what we should expect, if now we're going to put this kind of money into abstinence teaching.
Well, if we expect poorly out of children, we will get poorly. If we don't hold them to a higher standard, we will get that. And so I think teaching abstinence education, we shoot for a higher standard, and if some fail, then some fail, but at least we shot for the higher standard, and some will succeed, and they will succeed mightily, and I think we should support that.
Were you taught abstinence?
Yes, I was.
And did it work?
It did. I was a virgin the day I got married at age 29. I've had sex with one woman in my life, and that's my wife. And I would hope that for other people. Thank you for asking.
Well, I just wondered, but perhaps that's why you believe what you believe, and I
think that's a lot of why that I was able to go to school and do other things, is that my parents did teach me that and established that in me, and I hope to be able to establish that in other children so they can do the same thing, so maybe they can be here someday as a state representative, as a physician, and as a man who is taking care of his family.
And so you believe that what was good for you is good for everybody else?
I believe what's good for me is good for a lot of people. And so it certainly worked with me, and I'm certainly going to try it with my children, and I'm going to tell them at least 25 more times to please do abstinence and to do whatever it is that is taught in the STD prevention. Because I think that's what's going to work for them. It's what worked for me. And again, if you hold people to a high standard, sometimes you get it.
Well, I know, and sometimes you don't. As you suggested in your district, apparently that is not working, at least to the best that you'd like for it to be.
I haven't got to talk to everybody yet, but we're trying.
But the people you have talked to, I mean, do you have any evidence that they have succeeded in waiting until 29 and they've only had sex with one woman?
I have some. Just a few weeks ago, we had a nice little...
Well, now, since you brought it up, was that the first woman you asked?
I'm sorry?
I just wanted to know if that was the first woman you asked.
The first woman I asked?
Yes.
I'm not sure that's a real appropriate question.
Well, you brought
that's
it
the
up.
first
You
one
said you started telling me about you had had sex with only...
The House will come to order.
You started to tell me about you had had only sex with one woman.
That is correct.
And that you were 29 when that happened.
That is correct.
And I asked, my question was...
The House will come to order. Ms. Collier, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
I'll yield for a question.
I would like for his comments to be written in the journal, but I do have a question because I want to make sure that we're providing medically accurate information Earlier, you stated that you cannot get STDs without sex. Is that what you?
You can get, well, it depends on what your definition of is and what your definition of sex is. So without the...
There's a federal website.
I mean, I can go through all this if you want to, as far as how you get HPV, how you get...
well, according to a federal
other
website,
diseases,
the federal
but
government.
I'm not sure that's something that you want to go into in this
Because
particular forum.
you're talking about removing, funding for programs for HIV and STDs.
I'm talking about shifting funding from one place that talks about decreasing the chance of HIV and sexually transmitted disease to another place that can prevent
But I
sexually
want to make sure
transmitted
that
disease and HIV.
you understand fully, because if you still think that you cannot get an STD without having sex, then maybe we need to educate you on how you can get an STD, because you can get genital herpes and warts without having sex.
You can. It's awful hard through your clothes. So I mean, again, we can talk about this kind of stuff, but you have to have skin-to-skin contact.
Representative.
I'm not sure that's
Yes,
the
Turner.
appropriate